Real questions, real answers for real life. Come on in and pull up a chair. You're at 1850 Main Street with Michael DelGiorno and David Zanotti.
Have you ever heard of the shadow campaign to save democracy? You're about to.
So the article that we've been talking about with pro-lifers who back in the summer of 2020 got caught and arrested for putting chalk marks on the sidewalk outside an abortion clinic. It was with a statement along the line of "Unborn Black Lives Matter." Protesters in Washington, D.C. were out in the streets and for weeks and weeks back in the summer of 2020, and they were all involved in they painted the streets with Black Lives Matters logos and statements, etc. Well, this group of people decided that they would do the same sort of thing in front of an abortion clinic. They got arrested. Interestingly enough, no one that was painting the streets got arrested. And just recently here, it took them a couple of years to get their way through the courts to have their conviction overturned, where a federal court said, wait a second, we got these people walking around the streets doing this, and there's no prosecution. There's no arrests. But you've got somebody doing this with chalk over here on the sidewalk, and now you're throwing the book at them and trying to throw them in jail. And it took 3 years for them to get to that point where the charges were dismissed. But that story's going to just disappear, right? I mean, who the heck cares about two pro-life protesters with chalk? All right? I mean, who cares? But it brings the question up about the system of justice that we have. And are we going to be a system of equal protection under the law? And are the rules going to be the same for everybody? I'm not sure there's a way to put into words how desperately important this is. And I worry, like with your kids, I worry.
Oh, yeah.
Are they growing up believing that there is a 2 or 3 or 4 tiered system of justice based upon which people group you identify with?
Yeah, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves. We have moral relativism, which is rolling eternal dice and saying whatever I believe is true. And it begged the question once we did that and accepted that as a culture and moved into new tolerance, which is another theme that is woven in all this. How far of a leap is it to go from eternal moral relativism to legal relativism? And I think what encourages me about this story, even though it's discouraging, it took 3 years, at least we know we can still go to court. And there can be some sanity, some righting of the unequal application of law.
Right. If an organization will come by and willing to do it pro bono, because had that not happened, these folks, I'm sure, probably could never have been to court, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. But
we saw that. But David, how is that any different than what we saw with Black Lives Matter?
Well, let's go back to the summer of good trouble. Remember that?
Well, yeah. Kamala Harris, of course, was famous for that line in a debate that this is good trouble. This notion that, is this demonstrating or is this rioting? Is this demonstrating or is this looting and theft and graffiti and destruction and so on? When they did it, it was good trouble. I don't have to tell you on January 6th, I didn't like a lot of things, but same kind of thing, only that one was called insurrection. So tell me what the difference between good trouble and anarchy and insurrection is. Well, it depends on which side you're on, right?
Yeah, what's your point of view? Which then brought us to the amazing story. And I don't know that this story could ever be told too many times, but especially now, because we're now in this position where the indictments of Donald Trump are covering all the news stories, and everybody's got an opinion. And one thing I do know about indictments is that when you first read all the charges and you get to all the claims, it sounds like, oh my gosh, everybody's going to jail.
Oh, yeah.
And then the lawyers get involved and you have these conversations back and forth. I saw that Rudy Giuliani couldn't help himself. He actually fell back into the realm of being a lawyer as opposed to a politician or a political consultant. It appears he was a much, much better lawyer than he even was as a mayor. And he was a good mayor, but he's a much better lawyer. He kind of commented recently, he's, I guess, one of the indicted co-conspirators in this case in Atlanta. And he basically said, so I'm being indicted on RICO. I premiered RICO prosecutions against the mob in New York.
The mob.
Do you think I don't know what RICO means? Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. You think I don't know those laws? You think I'm scared of a RICO claim when I know RICO from the start? So I thought to myself, wow, that's funny. Like, do you know RICO? Like, I know RICO.
Oh, you know? This reminds me of when we had a conversation about Steve Allen, and he obviously hit a nerve with me, and I just launched into this long historical account of Steve Allen and his uniqueness, and I could just sense you on the other end of the phone going, what? But I mean, we could do what? We could discuss this for 10 hours, how RICO and Giuliano dismantled organized crime. I mean, it's one of the great law enforcement victories of our lifetime.
It would be an amazing Netflix series. Yeah. Well, now, but what's also interesting about that is I could go back, and this is, boy, I'm loving this conversation because memories are coming right up. You might not remember a guy named Joe Scheidler.
No,
Do you remember that name?
I don't.
A pro-life activist named Joe Scheidler, and he came out around the time when Operation Rescue was a big thing.
Right. I do remember
so
that.
Scheidler and Operation Rescue. Scheidler preceded Operation Rescue. There's always been multiple approaches in the resistance to Roe v. Wade. And we look back in history, we'll see there's been people who've worked behind the scenes, people who were on the streets, and people who ended up getting arrested. Now, these were never violent protests.
No.
Now, people did take violence actions against abortion. It's something that has to be condemned always in every way and shape and form. But Scheidler was one of those guys who was edgy and in rhetoric and in persona. He kind of, I won't liken him to anybody else. He just was a unique personality, and he ticked a lot of people off. Well, he got slapped with RICO charges because of his position on the unborn. He got slapped with RICO charges. And there were other people who were ministers and authors in the Christian community who got slapped with RICO charges. And basically, they lost everything. The government came in based on RICO charge. And here was the deal. They were saying, because you're protesting against Planned Parenthood, you are trying to end their business. You're trying to shut them down.
Conspiring.
Yes, you're conspiring to close their business, which is a conspiracy of racketeering. Now, it didn't matter that Scheidler wasn't in an opposing abortion clinic. So it wasn't like it was apples and apples, or it wasn't that he was trying to get their money and put it into his pocket, that there was any gain to be gained from his protest.
The motives of life and saving lives, not destroying business, was obvious. I'm reminded,
Michael, they were prosecuted, and it was horrific what they went through. All right, so it's not the first time that somebody has tried to take apples and oranges and mash them all together in regards to an unequal application of the law.
When you were teaching me on what Planned Parenthood, this latest strategy to create a right that they have no authority to create in order to what I call the blank check for death. But as we read the constitutional wording, which was mind-boggling, it was as if it was a license to harass anybody that opposes at any level. And when we're talking about this, I can't help but notice, and this is what they're doing already without that law. Can you imagine when they have it?
Well,
or doesn't that further echo in the discernment we had that this is their ultimate agenda? We can see it what they're trying to do, not just in that constitutional language, but as they were doing it unconstitutionally for the last 3 decades.
You can run the best campaign. You can even become the nominee. And you can have the election stolen from you.
How can you win with Russian interference, though?
That's the real
what I'm
thing.
scared about in 2020.
But rightly.
Because I think he's an illegitimate president that didn't really win. So how do you fight against that in 2020?
You are absolutely right.
He's an illegitimate president in my mind.
Would you be my vice presidential candidate? Folks, look, I absolutely agree.
Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered.
Russia interfered with our election, attacked our democracy for the sole purpose of artificially placing someone at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They were successful.
Trump knows he's an illegitimate president.
It's difficult because we constantly try to compare apples and oranges. And you've reminded me a bunch of times that when people get on the hypocrisy crusade, it's not fair. They don't do the same thing. They don't treat the same thing. We're not allowed to lie. They're allowed to lie. And I've heard you say it bunches of times. Well, of course they are. They're moral relativists. What did you expect them to do? Well, that's one thing when it's campaign politics, whether it's the books you write, whether it's slander or libel, whether you choose to treat people the way you would like to be treated. Look, and Christian people, by the way, are not exempt from serious criticism in this regard as well. There's plenty of hypocrisy about the way we treat other people. And I work every day to try to come to terms with the fact that Jesus said that if you've got an enemy, your responsibility is to love them and to pray for them. Man, I'm still a long way from some of those Sermon on the Mount attitudes that Christ prescribes for us. They're true. I'm the one with the problem. But given all that as disclaimer and just the stuff and the dust of reality, I went back and read the Shadow Campaign to Save Democracy. And that piece that was written by Molly Ball right in 2021, February 21, I can remember when you and I discovered that piece. We were like, it was unbelievable.
To this day, we're the only two that ever discussed it.
Well, it was more significant.
As far as I know, we're the only two that ever read it. You would think
more significant than the Little League World Series. All right, I mean, it was like you and I, which we really get worked up over the Little League World Series. We basically read this article, and I was stunned. I mean, our staff at the American Policy Roundtable was stunned. People say, "Can you believe they actually published, basically, and told everybody?" And let me tell you what we were really up to behind the scenes in the 2020 election.
Do you remember what our first response was? Which was, oh my gosh, there's going to be an investigation. People are going to get arrested.
How could you say this stuff out loud?
They're admitting they tampered with an election. Not only did that not ever happen, I remember you said, well, you watch. If it ever does come to light, now they can point us. Because remember, underlined in all of this story is that this Mike Podhauser, he needed this story to tell. He wanted America to know this story. It was important that America hear about this. And then you and I had this discernment and feeling, well, yeah, this is so when he gets prosecuting and say, well, we didn't hide any of this. In fact, go to Time Magazine. But nobody's ever called him on it, so nobody's ever noticed the article. Nobody's discussed the article but you and me. I'll add one other thing because, you told me you were rereading it. I don't know if you had the same experience I did. Reading it 3 years later, after my first impression, discussing it in my job, in a previous life.
Yeah, you and I were all over radio with this for weeks.
And then
we got criticized because we wouldn't get off of it.
But I have 3 years now of experiential knowledge. Mm-hmm. Remember we used to use those terms in Bible studies? But I mean, experiential knowledge. It's funny how this document read completely different for me this time. And I saw completely different things. And I have to ask you, did you as well? Because it's as if I never read it almost. That's how much different it struck me.
And in addition to that, given the indictments and the series of indictments that have all come up against Donald Trump,
they're more relevant than ever.
Oh my gosh, it was like a reverse echo chamber. It was hurting my ears as I'm reading this. The voice inside my head is going, what? And because now, well, let's just put it this way. When we read it the first time, our thought was, surely somebody could go to jail if someone picks up on this and begins to investigate systematically all the things they were doing to manipulate the outcome of elections and to manipulate public opinion and protests and marches and all the plans that they had Trump won. All the good trouble they were sending out onto the streets to the point where in the article, they actually took great time and length to explain how restrained they were as the election votes were still being counted and there was anything in question, and how their pollsters told them, tell the people to stand down, tell the protesters to stand down, tell the rioters to stand down, because we're probably going to win this thing. And we don't want to create a scene if you can be patient. But now, could you imagine if the order went the other way, if they really thought, oh my gosh, Trump is going to win this? What would the marching orders have been? Hit the streets and then what?
Actually, we did make that observation 3 years ago. What was this really about? The plan of insurrection had Trump won, and we only got to see the stand down version, which was all the things done leading up to the election to try to sway the election. and then, oops, it worked. So we didn't see what the ultimate plan was. I mean, somebody was told to stand down, which means somebody was prepared to act and had orders to act.
And had a militia basically ready to march. What
didn't happen that would have happened had Trump won? Not that they left many stones unturned for that to happen. I want to share with you some of the things that were key to me viewing it differently that I think opens up a whole other discussion. One, the Y2K effect. I didn't catch that 3 years ago. Did you catch it reading it this time? That they were so convinced that if Trump won, there was going to be chaos, mass chaos. Or if Trump lost, there'd be mass chaos. It was, remember when Y2K was predicted, the whole world was going to come down, and then it didn't happen. All right, so that was the first thing that struck me more 3 years later. The other, I remember because I drove to your house, I was very concerned. And I told you, based on a company I was working for in communication, I'm sensing that there's a place at the table with corporations. And in this article, I forgot, they sell that. The corporate America turned on Trump. It was an orchestrated effort to anoint a winner before the election ever took place, even, as Donald Trump said, while many states were still counting. So one of the first things it brags about is an alliance of left-wing activists and corporate titans. I remember that. I lived that. And it was a very specific narrative and had nothing to do with the vetting and voting of the American people in an election process. It wasn't even focused on that.
Well, let's pull that thread a little bit more, because the article goes on to intimate that the reason that the Chamber of Commerce came to this Kabul conspiracy, and by the way, they use these terms about themselves.
I know it.
They use the term cabal. They use the term conspiracy. When their definition of saving democracy was making sure Donald Trump didn't get elected, then if their second step was if he did get elected, their job was to see to it that there was so much chaos that the election couldn't be sustained. Now, this is not my words. This is their words. But the chamber, according to Molly Ball, came to the table because they were so troubled by the good trouble of the summer of 2020 that they were afraid that if Trump won, there would be chaos in the streets again, and that would be bad for business.
So Mike Podhorzer is the one he was union guy for
AFL-CIO
decades.
Guy, yeah.
AFL-CIO. He's the one that brokers the deal with the Chamber of Commerce. And then you get large corporations involved, and they're setting the narrative, and they're strategizing how they would silence any dissenting points of view, how they would set the narratives for everyone, how they would use social media, mainstream media. But then you get to this paragraph. The handshake between business and labor was just one component of a vast, to your point, they use the vast right-wing conspiracy. Yeah. So this was a vast cross-partisan campaign to protect the election, an extraordinary shadow effort dedicated not to winning the vote, but to ensuring it would be free, fair, credible, and uncorrupted. For more than a year, a loosely organized coalition of operatives scrambled to shore up America's institutions as they came under simultaneous attack. By the way, these attacks, of course, are perceived.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, I've shared other examples of you. And it was to ensure that if Donald Trump won, it wouldn't be perceived legitimate. And if he lost, there was a genuine, now this is all in their head, mind you, a genuine paranoia that if Donald Trump lost, he was going to refuse to leave. Now, when you think back, that was a consistent thing you were hearing Hillary say, Kamala Harris say, CNN say, all of them. This was a set narrative. And Trump wasn't even refusing to leave. And he did leave, you know, but this was that Y2K element I'm talking about.
Sure.
They really thought he wouldn't leave if he lost.
So this is, obviously this conversation is going to have to keep going, but let's just take a minute and say, okay, where are we with this? Because in my head, it's hard to keep my hands around this thing. I'm thinking to myself, the reason that this got to me, and I wanted to talk with you about it, was because in light of all these indictments, I'm thinking to myself, if I'm the judge or I'm the defense attorney, I would take the article from Time Magazine in February of 2021, written by Molly Ball, and I would break it down and use it as evidence that everything they are accusing my clients of doing, they were doing precisely, boldly, with far more organization, far more funding, not only attempting to implement to alter the outcome of an election, but to continue on in all of the societal chaos if they didn't get their way, and that they were using this sort of force. It was a giant shakedown. Now, they're saying it out loud, and it's just the stark reality. So I was hoping that maybe somehow we could get people to reread this article in light of what's going on right now in the world of indictments.
Well, they desperately need to, and I don't have to be a Lincoln lawyer to tell you, everybody on my witness list could be harvested from this one article. I mean, wouldn't it be interesting to get Mike Podhorzer on a stand, or get the Chamber of Commerce on the stand, or the heads of major corporations? I can think of one I might have even worked for that might be interesting to talk to on a stand under oath. But yeah, listen, this was all. When I heard RICO, I mean, I knew they were playing games with counts.
Sure.
Because it just sounds worse. 18 counts, RICO. Translation. Yeah. But it could be, 18 different emails. But they like to play the game with the counts to make it sound much worse. But this was all in their head, that Trump would not accept anything but victory and was going to dismantle democracy if he lost. But there's no proof he did that. But what's in this Time article is a RICO. It is a confessed conspiracy to determine an outcome before it happens, based on their internal paranoia. I think it's, well, I said this 3 years ago, and I'll say it again today. It makes Watergate look like the minor leagues.
Clearly, this conversation isn't over yet. A link to the article discussed today is available in this episode's description. We hope you give it a read and join us next time. To help spread the word, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit 1850mainstreet.com. We'll see you soon.